Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, focusing on the recently launched policy brief of the Forum on Information and Democracy, which explores the potential of digital taxes on platforms as a support mechanism to fund quality journalism. So our agenda today will be the presentation of the key findings and recommendations, followed by a panel discussions with experts and colleagues from around the world to discuss experiences and approaches to such attacks across the globe, examining our options forward, despite a currently challenging political context. But before we get started, I will first hand over the floor to Camille Grenier, Executive Director of the Forum on Information and Democracy, for a few opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Shema, and hello, everyone. I will be very brief to get into the substance of today as soon as possible. But I just really wanted to thank everyone. Thank you for being here today, and thanks to the many colleagues and partners around the world who have contributed in the drafting of this policy brief. Of course, in our team, Emma Gruden, Katarina Zugel, but also Sophia Crabbe-Field, who has acted as rapporteur of this brief. And amongst the many experts, our dear colleague, Anya Schiffrin, who is here with us today and who has brought really invaluable inputs into the process. Our work at the Forum on Information and Democracy is really on information ecosystems, and this brief is part of our work on media sustainability that started already back in 2021 with a report we published calling for a new deal for journalism. It also builds on some of the conclusions from our Observatory on Information and Democracy, which run this meta-analysis of all the knowledge and the research that we have on information ecosystems, and which, amongst a lot of conclusions, notably highlighted the power asymmetry between the media and big tech corporations. So we hope that this brief and the proposals that are outlined here will help solve or be part of a broader effort to solve the power asymmetry in our information ecosystems. At the Forum, we will push and share this brief and the conclusions with the signatory states of the Partnership for Information and Democracy. And in this indeed particular context that we have, keep pushing for a multilateralism of democracies, building and bridging together to launch some ambitious reforms. Again, I said I won't be too long, so thanks again for being here, and I will pass the floor back to you, Emma. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camille. It is now my pleasure to hand over to Dr. Anya Schiffrin, Director of Columbia's University School of International and Public Affairs, for some opening remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am the co-director of the Technology Policy and Innovation Program at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. And I'm so honored to be here today. And it's so lovely to see many old friends on this Zoom and many new friends as well. So very glad. I think that the fact that so many of us are here and that we're talking about a sort of obscure subject of digital taxes is really a testimony to how sophisticated our community has become in terms of policy discussion, and also how desperate we are. I feel like, when I first started thinking about sort of media sustainability, media policy more than 20 years ago, the discussion was narrower outside of the US. There was a feeling, outside of Europe, there was a feeling that we don't want government involvement, that media outlets should figure it out for themselves, that, the market might provide, if not all the answers, some of the answers. And I think that there's been a sort of real wake-up call over the last decades as we've seen the power of the platforms grow and their unwillingness to really kind of play ball in any meaningful way. So I think that our community of sort of media development, media rights, journalism has really begun to look more creatively around the world for different ideas and different policy perspectives. And I think that when the Forum in 2021 wrote that wonderful report on the New Deal for journalism and mentioned taxes, a lot of us started thinking in the back of our mind, we should really look at this and we should think about what this means. And then, of course, when the OECD talks were, basically sabotaged by the United States, and it became clear that there was some kind of opening where, the US had told countries, get rid of your digital services tax, and, we'll have this new agreement instead. And then the new agreement didn't really happen. All of a sudden, people who hadn't really been paying attention to that framework had to start thinking about it. So I feel like this has been something many of us have thought about for a while. And I think that what's so important about this paper is that it brings together so much of the research and so many examples from around the world, and very systematically lays out some of the different options. And I think that kind of thinking and sort of really policy planning is going to be essential for sort of saving journalism and thinking for policy. So I really commend everybody, and I know so well how hard everybody worked. It felt like everywhere in the world, somebody would say, oh yeah, I just spoke to the Forum. They've just called me. So you guys consulted in Brazil and South Africa and Europe and Australia, and I feel happy because I feel like some of the people that, I've been working with were brought in, like Tommaso, who's here. And then obviously my students and I had written a paper for Steve Waldman that we'd never published, and you drew on that as well, so I just want to quickly acknowledge Philip Crane and Emma Goldhaber and Rena Mensing, who worked on that paper. So I feel like this is the most comprehensive study of this topic that we've seen. So I think that's really interesting. I think that for a lot of us, the idea of using taxes to fund journalism, what's always worried me about it is that it's a heavy lift, because you have to persuade governments to tax, which is never popular. Then you have to persuade them to put the money towards journalism, also never popular. And then you have to figure out the distribution, which is always so hard. So, in a way, the bargaining code was more convenient because it just said to the journalist organizations plus the platforms, figure it out yourselves. This takes more work. And then I guess my final comment, because obviously we want to go to the experts right away, is this is precisely the kind of thing that Donald Trump administration absolutely hates. We've seen that when Australia started talking about a digital levy last fall, I think Trump immediately put out something saying, we're going to double the taxes on Australians living in the US, like completely illegal, but said it anyway. And I think that we've seen how the platform pushback is so powerful. I think Clips and a bunch of investigative journalists are going to be releasing a series soon on platforms and how they've sort of influenced lobbying around the world. So I think there'll be tremendous pushback. The US obviously would oppose all of this, and they've now got these companies working with them very, very closely. So I think that, this may not happen in the next 6 months or in the next year, but I think it's very, very important to think and have these debates and not really let the US dictate terms. So I'm really glad that we're having this conversation. I think it's the beginning of the conversation. We're all going to have a lot to learn. Tommaso pointed out that Poland is now talking about one of these taxes. I was just in Austria and couldn't really get a full read about their tax. So I think we're going to be learning about that today. And thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Anya. So yes, let's move on to the detailed presentation of the brief. I will hand over to our rapporteur, Sophia Crabbe-Field, who will explore a bit our findings and recommendations. There will be some time for a Q&A afterwards, the questions on the brief itself, before we move on to a panel discussion with colleagues and another Q&A. Over to you, Sophia.
Thanks, Emma. I'm just trying to figure out how to share my screen. Sorry, just bear with me 1 second.
Yes, you should be co-host now. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I think you can see it now.
Yes.
Um, um, okay. Sorry, I'm not very good at this, so thank you everyone for bearing with me for that. So I'm going to present the brief itself. So some of our findings and our key recommendations on the idea of applying polluter pays principle to big tech platforms. So as Anya just mentioned, this has been on the radar of the forum for a while now, since the New Deal for Journalism report came out in 2021 and provided the idea of a tax as a possible remedy to fund some of the funding issues with journalism. So to date, we've seen some of the existing responses to the market imbalance in journalism, and these have included, subsidies and grants, tax credits. There's also been the copyright responses, for example, ancillary copyright, which we saw in the 2010s in Germany and Spain, for example. There's been the implementation of the EU copyright directive. There's also been, of course, the bargaining codes, which we all know about. But we also, consider some of the drawbacks of some of these existing remedies. For example, in some cases, like in Australia, there was, considered to be a lack of transparency with the bargaining code. Sometimes there was a negative impact on small publishers. Or, small publishers were considered to be left out. There's maybe sometimes limitations on the applicability of some of these remedies globally. And there's, of course, the reactions that we saw from the platforms, for example, the news media, the Meta news ban in Canada, and sort of the inability of countries to properly respond to some of these. And so in response, we saw some jurisdictions like California actually make direct deals with, for example, Google. But of course, there's no sort of regulatory, there's nothing sort of regulatorily holding companies to account there. So for example, Google has already said that they're going to give less money than they were originally going to give for that fund in California. So again, why a tax? The chance to improve on some of these issues with bargaining codes, the chance to improve on transparency. And we also see DSTs proliferating in a lot of different countries. And, this is the chance to implement the polluters pay principle. So Anya already mentioned some of this sort of context, the state of play of DSTs. Of course, there has been a failure to implement something at the global level, a new global tax agreement, and the Trump administration again said in February they were pulling out of those discussions. And at the same time, you see in over 30 countries that have proposed unilateral DSTs. These are both OECD countries and non-OECD countries. But of course, we're still acknowledging that the Trump administration has also made the situation difficult for countries that do want to implement a DST. He's railed against them. He's said that he's going to implement revenge taxes, for example. So you had Canada pulling back on its DST or rescinding its DST. But you have countries like Poland, as Anya mentioned, that are saying they're still going to go forward, and they're actually talking about a tax that would put some money towards quality media content. So the taxes that we actually looked at in this brief, these include, first of all, as part of our recommendations, a broad-based DST. So these are turnover taxes on money earned by digital countries in a country where the service was actually delivered, regardless of where the company is based, so regardless of the physical presence. And these commonly include a number of different services. So these are sort of the four primary categories of services that are often encompassed by broad-based DSTs. So again, a pro is that it enables countries to tax multinationals operating without having to, without having regard for physical presence alone in terms of the headquarters of the company. It also targets companies that are avoiding taxes. Many digital platforms are currently avoiding taxes. It's If you look at a broad-based DST, it's potentially less prone to market distortions of one single market because it's targeting a number of different markets. If you have a broad-based tax, you can also tax potentially at a lower rate because you're taxing a multitude of services. You might also have less chance that the US government is going to say you're just targeting US companies. So then we also looked at a number of examples of these kinds of taxes. So for example, you have the tax that Canada had before June, of course. It was a pretty well-regarded tax by a lot of experts. It covered a number of different areas. It used the threshold of 750 million euros, which was the threshold put forward by BEPS 2.0. It was also the threshold that the European Commission had proposed in 2017. It had a domestic threshold of 20 million Canadian, and it targeted services, companies that were not just digital companies. It covered companies that included digital elements to their business. So it was less targeted just towards a specific number of digital companies, but it faced a significant pushback from the US from the beginning, with the US opening 301 investigations, with the US saying it was in violation of the US-Mexico trade agreement. And of course, it was rescinded recently. And then you have Kenya as an example of a non-OECD country that's also implemented a digital service tax. The rate is lower than in a lot of OECD countries at 1.5%. And also, like a lot of non-OECD countries, there's no minimum threshold. And the scope is really broad and covers a really large array of digital products and services. And then we also looked more specifically at digital advertising taxes. So DSTs that are specifically targeted to digital advertising revenue. So of course, a pro of this is that there's a very clear rationale for the tax. There's a clear justification. You're clearly, redistributing revenue that once went to publishers back to publishers from the platforms, and it might be easier to calculate and administer than a broader-based tax. But of course, there are still some of the legal trade vulnerabilities that exist with broader-based taxes. It could potentially be more market distortive. And there are the considerations of how much do we want publishers to be relying on the digital advertising market, and will we end up sort of enshrining a reliance on digital advertising? So, again, like Anya mentioned earlier, we did look at the example of Austria. There are other examples, for example, in Maryland, in the state of Maryland. So this tax also has a revenue of 750 million euros, with the scope looking at online ads. And some of this money is going towards a digital transformation fund for media, even though it's not directly earmarked. The expectation was that it would bring about 20 million in revenue, but in 2024 alone, it brought about 124 million, and 20 million of that went to media. And there is some talk about whether that money could actually be more directly earmarked towards media. So then we also looked at a few other taxes that didn't make it into our final recommendations, but I think they're worth sort of looking at just for the discussion. So there's taxes that are calculated based on user value, or the number of users in a country. There's different names for these kinds of taxes: data excess taxes, data barter taxes, and there's been different discussions of how you could determine the tax base. So will you use advertising revenue as a proxy? Can you use, for example, the value of user time? So that's not been determined in one, just one definition of this tax so far. And the pro of that is really tying the tax directly to the surveillance advertising system, to the extraction of user value, to the negative externalities of the system itself, and really creating directly a tax on the pollution to the information environment. And taxing something that's traditionally been outside of the taxation system. But the difficulty with that is there isn't really an existing example, at least from what we could see, of such a tax that has been actually implemented. It may face a lot of the same resistance as some of the other taxes. It's still sort of ambiguous in terms of how would we obtain the information necessary from platforms. Would there be data privacy issues for users in terms of like the way that we're going to define user time, user value? There could be changes in the sort of use and value of data in a system where, AI is becoming more prevalent. So that could, it could be really hard to sort of pin down exactly how to go about such a tax. Then we also looked at cultural levies, which are really interesting because they're already naturally hypothecized, so they're naturally earmarked. And they exist in a lot of countries, and they already go towards cultural production, for example, the production of local media or films or art. So it's already indexed, it's already often going to like a designated fund. You have the fact that it's a levy, it's not a tax, so it might not face all the same pushback that taxes will. And you also have sort of the existing rationale that there is a cultural exception for these kind of levies. In a lot of existing trade deals, for example, it's sort of accepted that you can have this money going towards cultural matters. But the big issue, we were looking for something that would generate a lot of revenue, and often there might be less revenue directly generated from this kind of levy. Not all countries might have the infrastructure in place or the kind of bodies in place to implement this kind of a levy. So it usually comes from the idea that private companies are making use of public or semi-public institutions, and you're redistributing some of that money back, but it has to be proportional to the benefit accrued. So it's not necessarily an infinite amount of funds there. So a couple of examples of that, you have, for example, France's famous YouTube tax. You also have Canada, where there's money from broadcasters that goes towards the Canada Media Fund. And since 2023 and the Online Streaming Act in Canada, you also have money coming from foreign online streamers. And there's also been pushback in Canada that this violates the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, again, despite the fact that there's cultural exemptions. But there has not been the same pushback in terms of France or in terms of some of these European cultural levies, from what I know at least. And then a last tax that we looked at is an extended VAT on digital services. So a big benefit is that some people who think that DSTs contravene some of the global trade rules feel that VATs are in line with them. It might be easier to implement. There's so many countries, even more countries than have DSTs, have a VAT already in place, and it could raise a lot of money. But of course, you have the fact that there's a distortion of this falling on consumers. There's the fact that the US doesn't have a VAT system. And, a VAT is considered efficient, but it's not considered as efficient by a lot of experts as a DST that is on economic rents of these companies in, countries where they're making money without a physical presence. So here's just a couple of examples of the many countries that have extended their VATs for digital services. Often the rate is a bit, higher than with a DST, and there's often a very wide scope of services that are covered. So of course, here we have, the main examples that actually exist in real life of taxes that are earmarked for journalism. So we have the Austrian tax, which we've already mentioned a couple of times. But, of course, this is a 5% tax on digital advertising, and money has been going towards a fund. Of course, it's not been earmarked, but there is the possibility that it will be earmarked in the future. And then we have a number of real life proposals of these kinds of taxes that are like directly connected to journalism. So there was the data extraction mitigation fee in California, which of course money would have gone to a number of different programs, tax credits, fellowship, freelance support, but it was stymied when there was the agreement between California and Google. So they got rid of the existing other existing proposals in the state. Then there's a couple of proposals that have been made in other US states, for example, in Hawaii and in Washington. There are people in this call who would probably give a better update than me, but from what I know, these are both sort of stalled in the process at some point. Then, of course, we have the Australia Media News Bargaining Incentive. So that's really, however, to incentivize companies that are part of the bargaining code to adhere by the bargaining code, because they're already trying to sort of pull back on those deals. Then we have the Media and Digital Platform Inquiry in South Africa, which also suggests a levy, but also in case of failure to implement other remedial actions. And then we have a couple of European countries, Germany and Poland, that have recently said that they're going to implement, or they're looking into either a tax on digital advertising or a digital service tax. And as mentioned, in the case of Poland, they actually have talked about the possibility of some of that money going to quality media content. So in the brief, with the fact that there aren't, many implemented real-world examples, we did also look at a number of examples or proposals from academics and NGOs, some of who I think are in this call. And, I won't go into them in detail here, but if you want more details, you can look into the brief. We have a table that goes through some of the main aspects of these. But some key takeaways when you look overall at the existing proposals, a lot of them target specifically digital advertising, I think because there is that clear link there that's easy to make. Many of them target gross revenues. A lot of them propose progressive taxes, which are not in many of the existing proposals, but a lot of these academic and NGO proposals have it. A lot of them target specifically the larger platforms. Many emphasize the need to actually, try to create market changes. And this is something, in the case of Austria, for example, they didn't actually see real market changes so far from the tax. They saw a big collection of revenue, but not really, the changes that were hoped for in terms of, rebalancing the market. And a lot of them emphasize the need to create a really specialized earmarked fund where the distribution of money is very clear and very transparent, et cetera. So something we did actually look into as well is the distribution of funds. So we don't give a specific recommendation in terms of the distribution of funds because it is so dependent on the existing institutions in a country, the existing capacity. But we did look at 4 existing forms of distribution that exist right now in many countries, in which countries could potentially consider moving forward with such a tax. So there's using existing media or press regulatory authority. So that means the funding comes from a general state budget. So this is what happens in the case of Austria, for example, where it goes through RTR Media, and through this, there's the Digital Transformation Fund, and funding is awarded on a project-by-project basis, depending on the proposals put forward by different media organizations. Then you have a dedicated budget line via Ministry of Finance or Culture. So you have a specific line item in the budget that's going towards media funding. So for example, that's what exists in France. You have the Minister of Culture budget, for example, that includes funds allocated to media and even to Agence France Presse. And then you have a third funding mechanism, which is pooling money into an independent fund that is at arm's length from the government, and you use a defined set of criteria to distribute the money. So these are, for example, Canada and France with their existing cultural levies. And here are a few other examples of, quite successful funds that exist. There's a Dutch journalism fund in the Netherlands. There's also a Tanzania Media Foundation. For example, in Tanzania, this is actually a bit different because it's administered by a Dutch non-governmental organization, and it's aiming to advance media's role as a watchdog and gatekeeper in the country. There's also the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium, which has awarded grants to a number of different organizations to combat news deserts and misinformation, and specifically to help access to information among specific communities, specifically low-income and underserved racial and ethnic communities. I think when we wrote this brief, I think they had not been awarded money for this upcoming year, but I think that they have just been actually awarded a new sum of money for the fund. And then, of course, there's also a proposal in the Media and Digital Platforms Market Inquiry from South Africa. And then, of course, the fourth way is, the mechanism that was used in Australia and Canada, of course, slightly different in both countries. In Canada, the money was in the end distributed through one collective because of the final deal between the Canadian government and Google. So it looks a little bit different, but the idea of the news bargaining codes was for money to go directly from the government to the different media organizations. Oh, sorry, from the companies to the directly to the media organizations. So finally, we also looked at some of the general rationales and the general challenges of implementing a digital tax. So, some of the big reasons are just generally for tax fairness, the fact that these companies are making money from news and, they're not paying for it. The fact that they are, shifting their profits to tax havens, so there's the issue of corporate social responsibility. There's the issue of taxing companies, for example, AI firms, before they start making huge profits. Then there's just, the research tax analogy. It's already, this kind of taxation is, used, or this kind of rationale is used with respect to natural resource extraction. But of course, there are all the challenges to implementation that we already looked at or discussed, like the legal risk, the opposition from the US. And there are, critiques of certain experts who say that, these kind of taxes will be distortive. There's a risk of double taxation. And there are also critiques from the point of view of, further entrenching surveillance capitalism, further entrenching reliance on, the existing mechanisms of surveillance capitalism, just enforcement issues, trade issues. And of course, there are US legal challenges for, US states that are trying to implement this kind of tax. We also looked as well at some of the rationales and challenges for earmarking. So, some of the issues that we, discussed before, the market imbalance, the role that media plays, as a fourth estate, and the idea that that platforms have this sort of impact on, civil society, and so they're reinvesting some of their funds back into, so something that benefits all of us, really. And then, we looked at some of the challenges to implementation with all the, current considerations around, so many services are defunded currently. So, why would people want to earmark specifically to journalism when there are so many other issues that need attention? There's the issue of implementation in terms of creating, definitions. For example, what is really public interest journalism? Where should these funds go? And, there's also struggles with implementation, design, possibility of lack of transparency, all the usual issues that come up when trying to implement something like this. So we came up, based on this work, we came up with a basic set of recommendations. So we recommend that countries implement a digital tax with part of the money earmarked towards journalism to support the news sector. And this would be based on a polluter's pay principle. So we suggest, first of all, a broad-based digital services tax, or alternatively, in some cases, an advertising focus tax. In some cases, we believe it might be easier for certain countries to implement this second tax if they can't implement something that's more broad-based. For example, in Austria, they had an existing advertising tax, and they were able to extend that to digital advertising, so that was sort of easier to implement. But for some of the reasons mentioned previously, we think the ideal would be a broad-based digital tax. Something we also considered was the need to take into consideration the impact of artificial intelligence and make sure that the tax is future-proofed. So, this might be, for example, the definition of platform should take into consideration the ways that we expect, artificial intelligence companies to evolve in terms of, advertising, in terms of the sale of user data. So it must be, part of the consideration of how we define a platform in such a tax. And we set out a few principles as well for the implementation, the use of an independent agency that's, independent, nonprofit, at arm's length from the government, and that has independence in terms of editorial decisions. And finally, we think, the companies should work towards global cooperation on this kind of issue, but they shouldn't wait for an international framework. We think countries should go forward and take action as much as possible. So thank you. And if you want to read the brief, it's now up on the website, so you can get more details about anything that I mentioned here.
Thank you very much, Sophia. As said, we will soon move on to the panel discussion with our experts and colleagues. But if anyone has questions on the brief itself now, or we can also keep them to after the panel discussion. I see one in the chat from Neil. Hi, Neil. Thank you very much for also contributing to the brief regarding the distribution. Would you like maybe to take the floor to share your question? Maybe it's easier.
Sure, yeah. I will just, can everybody hear me? Okay. Yeah, I'll just read my question. So I said my question concerns the distribution of tax funds. We want to fund fact-based public interest journalism or quality journalism. We do not want to fund news media that do not adhere to journalistic ethics of fact-based fair reporting. But at the same time, we don't want to discriminate on the basis of viewpoint. But as the brief notes, it's not easy to agree on a widely accepted definition of public interest journalism. So for me, as difficult as the questions are about determining the right kind of tax, these are even more difficult, right? But very, very important, right? So because we don't want to subsidize news media that don't really adhere to fact-based reporting. In the United States, there are many of them, right, who say that they're news media, but they just peddle in conspiracy theories and they do not adhere to fundamental journalistic ethics much of the time. So in practice, I wonder, how do countries define, right, which kind of journalistic entities qualify for subsidies, right? Those countries that do subsidize media. Is there some independent assessment of news quality? Do we want fact checkers like NewsGuard to help us determine the sources of the credibility of the sources as a way of determining which news media should qualify for funding? So those are my questions. I don't know if there are answers, but I'm very curious to hear if anyone's written about this, if there are reports. In the United States, this is a very serious problem because there's a whole right-wing ecosystem of news that does not adhere to fact-based reporting, right? So how do we differentiate?
I mean, so I think you could probably even have a whole other brief looking just at like the distribution question. I think, primarily we were starting out with the question of, the collection of funds, but I think it's obviously, that's why we did include in the end distribution, because I think it's such an important consideration. I think there have been people, like, for example, I know Anya has done some work on, writing about distribution of funds. I know in the Canadian example like in the Canadian News Bargaining Code, I know a little bit about that. And in that case, there's definitions in the regulations that were made, there's definitions in the law itself, and it's the CRTC. So the Canadian, what does it stand for? Well, it's the Canadian Radio Television, I don't know, but so it's sort of like the regulatory authority that ultimately decides how to apply the regulations. So it is sort of left to the experts. In some of the, in the examples that we gave, some ways that the distribution, should be considered. And we propose the idea of having sort of an independent group of, experts, journalists, make some of the considerations for how the money is distributed. So, just the idea that it's independent, that it's transparent, that it's not people that's at arm's length from the government, that it's not open to, political changes or changes in government. So I think, these are some of the considerations that different governments have made. So whether it's the regulatory authority or, an independent panel of experts, for example, I think there are a few examples out there. I think it is really hard to isolate it totally from, the government and from politics and everything, of course. But I think there are some relatively successful examples that we have, in the brief, and that I'm sure other people here have studied as well. I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I don't. I think you pretty much said it all. For this, the implementation question, I said, which is the most difficult part, and which actually we had a lot of thought about. And I think we're getting a lot of questions in the chat. I think many of them we will also address during the panel discussion. We have some of our panelists that are actually working on these specific issues. I think maybe one question also I saw in the chat, Sophia, was about why we decided to not recommend cultural levy instead of a digital tax.
So I think a big reason for that was, like I mentioned, mostly about how much money we could obtain from that. I think that is a really good consideration. And, I think we acknowledge in the brief that we are open to the fact that maybe in some countries there needs to be variations from, our proposal, given the constraints that exist right now. There are countries that have, like you said, a levy, and it might be more politically palatable. So I think that is really true. Like I was saying, usually that money is connected to the benefit that private companies are receiving from a public institution. So it's really in proportion to that, and it might not be able to be a huge amount of money, like the amount of money that we think we would, countries would be able to obtain from a broad-based digital services tax. So it's really just about ensuring the most money possible. But I think, for some countries, it could be interesting to extend existing cultural levy or industry levy, for example.
Thank you. So I think to stay on schedule, we will have to move to the panel discussion, but we will touch upon all these issues. So we have a couple of experts here, actually many that have contributed to the brief. Thank you very much for joining. I see a lot of familiar faces. I think now is just the time to do a round of table on what is the state of the debate around the world, what is the policy discussion around a digital tax, is there a chance for it being implemented? Anya mentioned that Poland is actually considering 3% tax on ads, despite threats of tariffs by the US administration. We know Austria has had this digital tax implemented, which has generated 4 times more revenue than expected. So there is potential for revenue. The question is not off the table for everyone, despite some like Canada who decided to pause the digital tax and because of commercial deals with the US. But so I will first introduce one of our speakers, Ester Borges, who is head of program at Momentum Brazil. Momentum is a think tank based in Brazil, focusing on the global south and explores intersections between journalism and technology. Esther, are you on here? Yes, I see you. So thank you, welcome. So you recently published a study on big tech taxation and journalism in Brazil. Could you just tell us more about the report and what were the conclusions? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, congratulations to Sophia and Emma for this critical policy paper. I had the opportunity to talk with Emma about it last week during the M20 Summit, and it is very, very insightful work. And it is a pleasure to be here and to share the main conclusions of our study. The first important thing I would say is that we did a legislative mapping here in Brazil, and we identified one law that has already been approved here with this theme, and it is already in force since 2024. And this law created a kind of corporate income tax surcharge in Brazil. It was inspired by the OECD Pillar 2 of the Unified Approach and the global minimum tax of 15% on the profits of large multinational companies. And in practice, this means that if a company operates in Brazil but pays less than 15% tax another country, in Brazil can collect the difference here. And this measure is already being applied, but it's general for all multinationals companies. It is not specifically directed at digital platforms or for big techs, and this is the big problem for us when we talking about this topic of integrity of information and journalism. We don't have nothing specifically here in Brazil. And beyond this, we mapped other 8 draft bills here in Brazil under discussion in Congress. And these bills try to tax digital operations through 3 different legal instruments. First one was social contributions, like CSSD in Portuguese, that these are taxes that under our constitution can only be used to fund social security spending, such as health, pensions, or social assistance. And you can think of them as earmarked contributions for welfare. The other option is a CD, which are contributions for intervention in the economic domain. They are earmarked levies designed to fund very specific public policies. For example, we have one draft bill that called CD Internet would direct resources to public education, provide computer and internet access. And the other one is the CD Detox Digital, would fund programs for children and adolescents, focus on treating the excessive use of digital technologies. And the other one is a proposed supervision fee for digital platforms, would go into a special fund called FISDigi, aimed at monitoring platforms' activities. And the third option we have here is a proposal that changed the confins. This is a Brazilian tax on companies' revenue, something similar to a turnover tax. And one bill proposes special confuse regime only for digital platforms. What all these proposals have in common is that the tax base would be the gross revenue through the activities. However, each bills define digital services or digital activities differently, and sometimes are marketplace, sometimes target advertising or monetization of user of data. And here comes the crucial point for us. No one of the bills currently under discussions earmark the revenue directly for journalists. The funds would go to health, pensions, education, internet access, or programs for children and teenagers, depending on the nature of the tax. If we want to big tech taxation to straighten journalists, this connection needs to be made explicit in our law. And our report concludes that Brazil has possible and viable instruments, but what is needed is legal clarity and the political will in this moment, so that taxation can really be turned into democratic impact, straighten our information system and our democracy. We need to be a big effort here under the external pressure and the internal pressure too.
Thank you very much, Esther. I will now ask Pierre Dagard, welcome. You are from Reporters Without Borders. You're head of advocacy. So as many know, the World Press Freedom of this year indicates that the economic indicator is at the lowest it has ever been and will continue to decline. And I understand that Reporters Without Borders has also advocated for a digital tax that would be redistributed by an independent body in your recent report on pressures on public media. So my question is, what is Reporters Without Borders' position on the recommendations of the brief, and why would you think this tax is important? What are your key positions on it? Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Emma, for the nice introduction. I have to apologize because I'm a little bit sick, so I'm going to keep it short, and sorry for my voice. Yes, as you said, we truly support the conclusions and the timing of this report, especially because in 2025 we decided to emphasize the when we do the RSF World Press Freedom Index every year, we use 5 different indicators, and the economic indicator is one of them. But it's true that, as you said, in 2025, it has reached its lowest point ever in the history of the index. And we even did a survey for the preparation of the index that revealed that in 160 countries out of 180 countries, the media that replied to our survey said that they achieved financial stability with difficulty or not at all. So it's becoming clearer and clearer that economic pressure may not be the most visible threat to press freedom globally, but yet is becoming the most significant one. And it's not just RSF saying this. If you remember, a few years ago, UNESCO had published a report on world trends in freedom of expression and media development. And in this report, they described media funding as an existential funding crisis, which was even further worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the UNESCO even said that there was a risk of extinction for journalism in certain areas of the world. So we are dealing with a very, very serious issue, which isn't limited to economic or taxation issue. It's actually a democratic issue that we are dealing with. The reason why we also are, well, the reason why we are so worried about media, the funding for media, is because we see in a lot of different parts of the world how a shortage of adequate resources can undermine journalistic independence, how it can foster editorial bias, how it creates vulnerability to the capture of media outlet by business and political interests, and ultimately limits citizens' access to reliable information. So it is a question that needs to be addressed. And a digital tax, whatever the revenue base for that, or whatever the forms of implementation, there are lots of very interesting points in the report about that, so which were mentioned earlier by the author. So I'm not going to go back to that. There are definitely some key questions to be resolved, but what we think is clearly what we clearly think is that this is a sort of policy solution that hasn't really been tested yet. As compared to other solutions, including what happened in Canada or in Australia, and those solutions have relatively failed to some extent to respond to the need. So it's not. We're not saying a taxation of big tech would be the one and only solution to resolve media funding problems, but we definitely think it is part of the solution. Another, and perhaps one or two last comments about the report. The one thing that also struck me when I was reading the report is how it's important for the media sector globally to be united in demanding that digital taxation, because to some extent, I think the failures or the shortcomings of what happened in Australia and Canada and other countries around the world was due to the fact that the media sector didn't really show unity in that, and that the platforms could talk and have bilateral negotiations with different media outlets respectively. So I think it's also very important that the message comes across to the media stakeholders globally, and that this report is read by media CEOs, and that they understand they have a common interest in demanding for big tech taxation. Maybe just one last remark in reaction to what was said and the question that was raised by Neil, how we are dealing with this question of distribution of funds. I think from an RSF perspective, we do see reliable information as something which depends on the way information is being collected and processed. So it never should be about the content itself. It should be about the ways, the methods, and there are a lot of existing codes of practices or code of conduct, call it whatever you like, that exist in national countries that self-regulate the way media outlets, journalistic entities should work. The difficulty is that, of course, there may be nationally oriented, or they may have born into a very specific national context, so sometimes they have some shortcomings, etc. Whereas on the other hand, the big platforms have global terms of use. So you need to address that gap between nationally driven, nationally constructed codes of ethics for journalism and the practice of platforms that are global. And for that, to do a little bit of self-promotion, if I may, RSF started a process, not alone, unfortunately, but fortunately, sorry, we started a process of drafting a norm, an international norm, like an ISO-type norm for journalism practices, which is called the Journalism Trust Initiative. And we did it together, in particular with Agence France Presse and the EBU, which is the European Broadcasting Union. And this is, as I said, an ISO-type norm, which include 18 clauses, 130 criteria about how you assess your internal processes for producing reliable information. It goes on topic from about transparency of management, transparency of ownership, of course, the transparency on the source of your revenues, whether you have an editorial charter, how you deal with journalistic sources, how you deal with conflict of interest, all that type of very essential questions, which basically are never about what type of content, the viewpoints you produce, but how information is being produced in your organization, how it is corrected if something goes wrong, etc. So that's one way, I think, to look at the issue. And I think definitely you're right in saying that the distribution of funds, that there should be some criteria, some conditions associated with that. We cannot just fund any sort of media outlet. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Pierre. So I will now move to Austria because as we've seen, Austria has in place a digital tax which at least in practice has some revenue that is earmarked to journalism. Eugen Schmidt, you are the CEO of AboutMedia Marketing Agency. Could you please tell us a bit more about how this digital tax came about and like what were the results 5 years later?
Sure. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. I want to keep it quite short as far as Sophia already summarized the Austrian way. Thank you for that, by the way. Austria was the first country in Europe to introduce a digital service tax back in 2020. 5 years later, we can clearly assess its impact. In 2024 alone, its revenues amounted to about 124 million euros. A portion of this is directed to the media support via the national regulator, which is only about 20 million euros, which are invested into the media market according to a tendering and project principle. However, the emphasis lies heavily on traditional media, particularly print outlets. In practice, this means that a significant share of money is used to prop up, as I would call them, outdated business models. The real potential of the tax to foster innovation, strengthen dynamic media environments, and support small and medium-sized players remains untapped. So this is something that we should do better and which we recommend to adapt. My takeaway, the tax works technically, it effectively targets the big platforms and generates steady revenue. But its impact on journalism remains limited as long as the funds are not used in a more forward-looking way, such as artificial intelligence, which we have heard already.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I mean, speaking of artificial intelligence, one of the recommendations of the policy brief is to actually take into account the big AI platforms who also benefit from quality journalistic content. Although for the moment, they do not make profit on the same basis as the big tech platforms. So maybe for this one, I would like to call Tommaso Faccio in, who thank you for being here today. You are the head of Secretariat of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporation Taxation. Sorry, that was wrong. But what is your position on the issue of taxing or including at least AI platforms for designing a tax? Is it possible to tax AI platforms without them generating profits for the time being?
Hi, thank you for the invite. I think the AI platforms have many of the characteristics of the other bigger tech players, and as such, we shouldn't differentiate. And it's important that one of the reasons for digital service tax in the first place was to create a level playing field between companies that are operating in one country and companies that provide services from abroad, selling services to customers in the country. I checked today in the UK, there's a number of big AA providers, and they're all registered for corporation tax in the UK. So they do pay, or when they will be profitable, or if they're profitable already, they do pay corporation tax. Many of these businesses will have marginal cost close to zero. So they will allow the revenue over time will equal profit. So it is important that we include AI. And there are, of course, some safe harbors that are already kind of included in digital service tax legislation. For example, the thresholds. So often there is a threshold that is targeted of revenues in the country that is targeted to be high enough so that then you don't catch the little companies or mini multinationals, but you tend to target the bigger companies that also tend to be more profitable. Also, for example, in the UK, we have a digital service tax, a 2% digital service tax, and it includes an incentive calculation. So the companies can actually calculate the digital service tax as a levy equal to 80% of the profit margin on the digital service that are generated in the UK through the digital service revenues. So there are ways to ensure that the companies that are not profitable are not called by the digital service tax, but clearly there are many characteristics that are very similar to the big techs, and therefore there's no reason why AI platforms should not be in scope for digital service taxation. An important thing that is not included in the digital service tax is actually how the AI platform gather data. Much of the data comes from newspapers and from other sources of media, and at the moment there's no payment for this data. So another question is, how can all media make sure that they generate revenues from AI platforms? Because at the moment I expect that most of this is captured free, and perhaps this is also something that should be considered in the future. Ultimately, for AI platforms, I expect that we'll see that a lot will be become almost monopolies, and as such, most of the revenue from potential DST targeting a platform will also come from a few of those AI businesses. For example, for digital service tax in the UK, around 90% of the tax came from only 5 to 10 companies in last year. So you can see it is very much concentrated. Therefore, if we were to target AI platform, most of the revenue, large part of the revenue will come from only a few companies.
Thank you very much. Very clear. I will go back to Ester on the context in Brazil. I understand for the moment there still needs to be some political will and also legal clarity for the implementation of such a tax. Where do you see this going forward, and what are the other alternatives in the meantime?
Talking about Brazil, given the current political context, I do believe that taxing big techs is feasible, but certain conditions need to be met. And Brazil, as I said, has already taken some concrete steps in this debate. The first was the approval of that law I mentioned. But this important advice, although it's not specifically targeted at digital platforms and journalism, and I think here in Brazil, an important inspiration from our own experience comes from sectorial funds. I know that it don't will work for all the countries or for all the sectors or for all the types of journalism. But our example and aspirational here now is the audiovisual sector fund. That is a fund has existed since 2006 and is primarily financed by Condecine, a fee levied on the revenues of telecommunications and audiovisual companies. And these resources collected go directly to finance productions, distributions, and public policies related to cinema and audiovisual content, and being managed by a specific agency created by it that called Ancine. This is a concrete example of how Brazil has already used taxation to create a sustainability for some sector and a very important sector. So when it comes to journalism, something similar would be possible here. And this has been our inspiration, a sectoral support fund founded by big tech taxation that would guarantee a stable resource for public interest journalism. And we need to discuss the implementation of it. But in this moment now, for our political moment, the point is to put it on the table of the government and the Congress. So the implementation is like a second pass right now. Our point for us today is to design this sectoral fund and a good sectoral fund with a design that is comprehensive and that could be implemented for the maximum number of journalists possible.
Thank you very much, Esther. Again, about the Austrian tax, you with AboutMedia are suggesting to earmark all of the income for the media. Do you see this proposal being taken up, and what are the arguments against it?
Well, the question of whether all revenues from digital tax should be earmarked for media is crucial. My view is yes, for media, marketers, and any other form of development of democratic national media market. First of all, earmarking provides planning security. It enables media organizations to invest long-term and to drive innovation. Second, it is a matter of fairness. Platforms extract enormous value from journalistic content. It is only logical to redirect this value back into journalism. And third, not least, transparency through earmarking would strengthen trust in the tax. On the other hand side, of course, there are counter-arguments. Parliaments insist on budget sovereignty and other public needs such as health and education also compete for funds. There's also the argument that no single sector should be privileged. Yet my conclusion is clear: without earmarking, the digital tax remains a political fig leaf. With earmarking, it becomes a strategic instrument to foster innovation, to better address fake news, and to safeguard media diversity in all forms.
Thank you very much, Eugen. And after Austria, there has been talks in Germany as well to move forward with a DST, a 10% tax on big tech. This was put forward by the German State Minister for Culture and Media. I will ask, we have with us the Executive Director of Reporters Without Borders Germany, Anja Osterhaus. Thank you very much for being here. Could you tell us more about where you see this proposal going and what would be the conditions for this to effectively support public interest media?
Yes, thank you very much. Calling you from Berlin, and it's great to see so many people from across the world discussing this topic, which is so important for journalism. So we have a new government since the beginning of this year, and it is composed of 3 different parties, and they make a coalition agreement. And in this agreement, it is written that they aim, that this coalition will aim during the coming 4 years to introduce, or at least consider introducing, a tax on online platforms that use multimedia content, and the revenue would benefit the media sector. So they do make the link in this coalition agreement, and we were very interested in seeing what's next. So next was that this Minister for Culture and Media, Wolfram Weimer, proposed such a tax similar to the one in Austria, a tax on the digital advertising, so on the advertising revenue like in Austria. And instead of 5% like in Austria, he wanted to levy 10%. So that's what he said many times. Other members of the German government are not that enthusiastic about the idea. Why? We all know why, because there's quite some hesitation and resistance by the US government against these kinds of proposals. And this has become very evident in the recent past when Donald Trump again posted on Truth Social how fiercely he will oppose any such moves. So since then, I'm even less optimistic than I was already before that there's gonna be such introduction of a digital levy anytime soon. That was said earlier by others as well. And I think this is something we as civil society need to think about, how we can convince our policymakers not to shy away from this endless demonstration of force by the US president on hundreds of different territories. So this is, I guess, really the battle we will have to fight in the coming years. So speaking about specifically what's happening in Germany, they are working on a proposal. So far, they say that in autumn they will also propose something, make it public. So until now, there's no public information about exactly how it will look like, except for these two things, on the advertising and on the 10%. But yeah, so we don't know, and we don't know whether it's really going to be published in fall, or whether the battles within the government will lead to being more silent about this in the near future, until we just need to fear in Europe and everywhere in the world that tariffs will be imposed on anybody who dares to tax digital platforms.
Yes, fortunately, that is very true. And I mean, the EU has also recently, the question of digital tax was back in the discussion, but they also backed down very recently on having it in its next budget. Tommaso, since we see that a global framework is not feasible for the moment on the OECD, and the EU would also need like a full validation from all countries. How do you think countries should strategize around the question of a digital tax, and what are our options, essentially?
So I think there's a couple of points I'd like to raise. The first is we're kind of still in the phase where we need to understand how countries are like to react to Trump's threats. He's now threatening countries such as France, Italy, Spain. They have a digital service tax, so they need to remove it. We saw that when the UK negotiated this trade deal, there was an attempt to remove the UK DST, but the UK government stood still and said this is off the table, and therefore we still have a DST in the UK. It is an old tax, and therefore it is, as they say, a good tax. It is working, as the colleague from Austria mentioned before. It is raising revenue. We expect £1 billion in the UK. In many countries, raising significant amount of revenues. And so a lot will depend on the position in individual countries. Why is Austria not being subject to the kind of the ire of Donald Trump? Perhaps because it is a smaller economy than France and the UK, and so there was less of a pressure for Austria to remove the digital services. We have countries, for example, in the global south, like Kenya and Nigeria, where the main trading partners do not just include the US, but also, say, China, India, and Europe. And so the pressure of a country like the US threatening to impose tariffs is less, might be less than compared to other countries. So each country kind of have to do their own maths to understand, okay, how much will US administration push back if we were to introduce a digital service tax? I think we see it was clear in the case of Canada that the Canadian government prioritized the fact that they needed to have a trade deal, and the trade deal in terms of size is tens or hundreds of times the size of the digital service tax at stake, and therefore perhaps it made sense for them to give in on that, because it was kind of happened fairly overnight after the legislation to introduce a digital service tax was like in the making for a number of years. So each country can do their own math and see, does this make sense and can we withstand US pressure? Of course, the more countries that do it, the more this become normalized, and it reduces the ability of the US to cherry pick against each individual country. The US is strong but can't take on the world. Finally, just a point that there is an ongoing UN process that started this year where they're actually dealing with this issue of taxation of cross-border services. This is all countries in the world negotiating. It is kind of superseding the negotiation of the OECD Inclusive Framework, Pillar 1 that is mentioned in the briefing. This though will deliver something in the next 3 years, and then it will take maybe 1 or 2 years to be implemented. So in the meantime, countries need to introduce unilateral measures. I think that on the positive, countries have a strong need to create and generate new fiscal resources. You mentioned that the European Union has dropped the idea of reviving the digital service tax proposal, but they're now considering a levy on big multinationals operating in the market. Again, this will also likely target digital multinationals, US digital multinationals, although it's not a digital service tax.
Nope, nothing to add.
Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tommaso. Thank you to our speakers. We have some questions in the chat. I think Sophia has tried to answer a few of them, but if someone wants to take the floor now, ask some questions to our panelists, something specifically. We also have many colleagues that have worked on this brief from Australia, from everywhere. If you would like to, ask a question, make a comment, this is your time. Feel free to take the floor. Yes, Peter, go ahead.
Oh, good morning or good afternoon from New Zealand. I'd like to ask the panelists and the FID colleagues here a question about the notion of polluter pays, and I put this in the chat, and I see that there's been a reply there. So thanks, Sophia, for that. But it seems to me that the normative rationales that we use to justify policies are incredibly important. And there are different ways of making sense of why we would introduce a tax, and we've already seen some examples of this in from the speakers today. You could implement a tax purely on the basis of we want a fairer tax system, and then it goes into the consolidated or general government fund and gets disbursed on schools and hospitals and roads. So the argument for saying that some of this or all of this has to be directed in a hypothecated form or an earmarked form towards media or journalism in particular really needs careful articulation. So I'd be interested to know in particular from our Austrian colleagues what kind of arguments were put forward there to justify the bits of the fund that were going towards journalism. And I don't know if other colleagues have arguments about the position that we might take in trying to make a case for a polluter pays approach. How do we articulate this in a way that there's a legitimation of the case for digital taxation or other forms of levy? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. I'll try to answer it. I hope I understood it right. Well, approximately 7 years ago, when the minister wanted to have this text because the pressure of the Austrian publishers was quite high, it was quite easy to implement it. The only questions were how to implement it without destroying the Austrian publisher market. The thing in Austria is the Austrian publisher market, let's call it the journalist market, is quite close to politics. So if the Austrian, let's call them newspapers, have a special need, politics listens very closely. And that is the reason why the implementation of this new text was quite easy. Apart from that, there was no digital text. By then, there was only an advertising text. That advertising text was for everything but digital advertising. And the advertising tax is 5% as well, so it was only a logical step to implement that digital tax. Did that answer your question?
Sorry, yes, thanks, Eugen. Yeah, that's very helpful. And I might just say it's pretty clear that if the news media themselves, stand to benefit from these measures, then strangely enough, they tend to support them in their editorials.
Well, yeah, as you said. But on the other hand side, I think the Austrian digital tax works very, very well. But it has some things that don't work as well as they should do, and that is the earmarking of only, as I said already, newspaper magazines. And it's not about the quality, it's about Austrian newspaper magazines as a whole. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement.
Thank you very much. I think we also have a hand from Julie Eisenberg. Hi.
Yeah, hello. I'm calling in from Australia. We're like New Zealand, it's very late. I thought I'd just answer that. I'd raise a few responses in relation to the Australian situations and also touch on some of the points that came up earlier. So when you talked about, how is it articulated, or how do you argue for this? In Australia, since about 2019, there have been a number of major public inquiries led by the government. So the Productivity Commission did a massive analysis of digital platforms impact, and out of that, that's where the News Bargaining Code proposal evolved. Since then, in the last year or so, there's been a big parliamentary inquiry into the impact of social media on democracy. So in these sorts of public inquiries, there are public submissions, there are media submissions. And so in those contexts, the public interest in supporting journalism, supporting media has been really strongly articulated. So it hasn't been about one sector having to put a campaign, but the argument of how it underpins democracy exists in all of these public policy documents. Now, the bargaining code itself was actually very successful for a few years, and in the last year, about $250 million came into Australian media organisations, and that employed hundreds of journalists. So there were problems with it, but the major problem was that Meta decided it didn't want to pay for news anymore and said it was pulling out. And the way the legislation was drafted, once the digital platform was no longer hosting news, it was no longer covered by the code. So the threat to pull out would take it outside the legislation, and what happened in Canada was sort of what they were threatening to do here. And they actually did pull the news down for about a week a few years ago. So their threat is real. And the government's response to it late last year was very interesting. So it hasn't yet been fully formed, but there is talk of a levy, and the levy is basically kicks in if an organisation doesn't bargain under the bargaining code. So it's an additional mechanism, and it's a set amount the idea is for a set amount of money, and the idea is that it cover organisations that are big digital platforms, whether or not they host news. So it might cover TikTok, it might cover social media platforms. The problem in Australia has been that that was announced in December, in about February, all the tariff wars broke out and there was a lot of debate. There was an Australian election in May, and the Prime Minister, who was campaigning for the election, said, you know, hands off our news bargaining code, we're going to stick with it, we're going to push this levy through. After that election, we got a new Minister for Communications, and so a lot of policy has just gone into a bit of a black hole. So the consultation that was supposed to happen on that digital levy on the big platforms hasn't happened yet, although we're expecting it to happen sometime later this year. So those things can happen, and the push for it, the recognition of the public interest in it, I think at least in Australian policy has been established over quite a few years. And I noticed in the New Zealand draft legislation for a bargaining code that's on hold at the moment, but I think some of that's been picked up there. The interesting thing is there's a provision in there, I think it was an amendment by one of the parties, that talked about AI companies having to pay where they take news. And I think that's one of the first provisions or draft provisions I've seen in the world. The opposite proposal happened in the UK, where they were saying that big training models don't have to pay for news. And there was a big campaign, obviously, in the UK this year by media companies against that. So just picking up on some of the things that have been discussed throughout the discussion today, there are these little glimmers of proposals that do touch on these things and do start to address them. And I think just watch this space in Australia, because we might see a bit more activity if the Prime Minister holds firm on what he said when he was campaigning during the election in May. You know, we may well see some sort of a levy proposal come through later in the year.
Thank you very much, Julie. I mean, this is thank you for clarifying the situation in Australia. And I mean, it sounds promising. Let's see how it goes. I think one last question, and then we need to conclude. Guy Benim, would you like to take the floor?
Yeah, sure. I'd just be very brief. I put some comment in the chat, but I would just echo the previous comment by Julie that from the, if you like, Brussels, Berlin, Paris, I mean, the whole rationale under the Digital Services Act of protection of civic space, protection of democracy, I think is very well developed. You'll see that the work that we're doing is to try the important thing, having a metric. I think this language around the harmful effect of, you've got an externality, yeah? How are you going to measure the externality becomes quite important. It's not just about the logic, we need some money for journalism, is a bit different than where we're starting from. We're starting from, okay, there's an externality here. We need to measure the externality and then we can tax it. So that's what the polarization footprint, which is looking at one specific thing, which is polarization. But the framework under the Digital Services Act has civic discourse, the whole Democracy Shield debate, which some of you are probably following quite closely. All of that is about building a case to say there are harms, and therefore the idea, whether it's tax or levy or fine or consumer boycott, there are different types of remedies that you might then start to think about. And so I would, in my own thinking, I kind of divorce this from the starting point not being how do we get money for journalism. But I understand that's an important point, but there's a kind of connecting it through in an advocacy case, which, by the way, I should have said at the outset, I really love the report, and it's something very interested to have read, and I hope we can continue to discuss. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I mean, we wish we could go on, but like we will put our email in the chat. We will take up some questions. If you would like to, discuss with us, please send us an email. We'll be happy to, continue this conversation. Just for some concluding remarks, I would just like to thank everyone really sincerely involved in the draft of this policy brief. I mean, especially Sophia Crabbe-Field, our rapporteur, who did a brilliant job, and also everyone who's on the call, who has helped, who has been interviewed. I mean, it's clear that since we started this policy brief a couple of months ago, the world has changed and the wind has changed, but we have to stay optimistic, and it will not stay like this forever. It's important that we have those types of discussion, and there's clearly a lot of interest for it. I mean, we have had many questions. We have many people that have written to us about the brief. So yeah, we need to continue to have this conversation, explore, do a deep dive into solutions that have proven to actually generate a lot of revenue, and also explore what fair compensation means in a broken market for journalism. But also not lose sight that it's not the only solution, that we need to create an enabling environment for journalists not only to survive, but to thrive and be innovative and competitive. And this will require a multitude of different solutions. And on this, I would just like to point that the OSCE will publish very soon a very comprehensive policy report on all these questions of safeguarding media freedom in the age of big tech platforms and AI. It will come out on the 22nd of October. You can see in the chats there is more explanation to it. So thank you very much for your attention today. Please do write us an email if you would like to discuss, and have a nice rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.